Kia ora, welcome all. I'm Jennifer Nicol. I'm the chair of the Climate Action Committee at Waikato Regional Council and one of the representatives for Hamilton Kirikiriroa. Today we're privileged to have you all here with us to listen to a presentation by Dr. Paul Winton titled Discover the Fastest Path to Zero. It will be mainly focusing on the topic of transport in the Waikato, and we have an audience here in the room as well as online. According to Dr. Paul Winton, transport is the one sector that has the highest return on investment for emissions reductions. In our region, transport makes up 16% of emissions, but is the fastest growing emissions source. So we need to get on top of it and fast. So it's great to have Paul here today to help us work through our options for transport. With a PhD in engineering and is a former McKinsey and Company consultant and founder of Temple Capital Investment Specialists, Dr. Winton advises funds and corporates on investments and acquisitions, typically in the industries undergoing or on the cusp of disruptive change. Using the same skills he has in his day job, he has analysed New Zealand's emissions and identified the most pragmatic path to a less than 1.5 degree temperature rise future that New Zealand has committed to under the Zero Carbon Act. Dr. Winton will be presenting on his model and discuss with us how the Waikato could accelerate its efforts to decarbonise the transport system. I'll be asking our chair of the Regional Connections Committee to close after this meeting, and now I welcome on Dr. Paul Winton. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me here today. As a bit of further context, the description there puts me out as an extreme right of Genghis Khan kind of a person, and I think that's probably true in my day job. But a couple of years ago, I had a wake-up call when I realised the seriousness of the climate change and climate emergency. Whatever language you put to it, and also the issues around biodiversity. And I decided that I was going to contribute a chunk of my time and our small firm's time to better understanding what and how New Zealand should best respond to its obligations. When I first started this, we did some analysis, and it was the most pragmatic response on New Zealand's path to pragmatic response to delivering on a 1.5 future. And I started a discussion, some of which I'll share with you today, and I thought I would be immediately laughed out of the room because clearly someone had done this work before and there was something wrong with the thinking. And what I discovered is there was an absolute vacuum, is that there hadn't really been any work done on who would have to give up their carbon when in order for us to deliver on a 1.5 future. And that work was based on forming a view nationally on for each sector, technically, economically, politically and legally, what was more or less difficult, and therefore what we might move first in order to get to a fair contribution on our part. So today I'm going to share with you the bones of that story, with a caveat that we're now moving into the maelstrom that is the consultation from the Climate Change Commission's work. And for those of you who haven't read the 912 pages in their 19 documents, there is a lot of thinking that's gone on behind it, and the consultation period is extremely rapid given the really transformative effect this may have on our economy, which has been likened to the changes that happened in the 80s, if not greater. So I will provide some commentary on that, and then I'm going to dig in on a story around transport, which, and this is a real career-limiting move for anybody speaking here, is it is Auckland-centric. It is Auckland-centric because the analysis has been done there. And I'm going to use that as a platform for discussing how a town might think about moving its transport system more aggressively towards one that aligns with what the science demands. So before I go to page one, I just wanted to say that we have you here on paper for an hour and a half. It's a really long time to be talked at by somebody. So what I'm going to do along the way is pause and just see if there's any questions in the room, and really, really welcome discussion and debate. Because of the time constraints, I'll be sort of managing that a little bit, but we can pick it up later on if need be. And also there will be there's an opportunity for those that are looking at this online to submit questions. I understand there is a delay has been put on me in case I put in a bad performance, where they can turn it off for 30 seconds, the standard TV swearing tool. I won't be swearing, which means that anything you see online will be delayed. So we'll try and allow a little bit of time for that. So moving straight into it. So the last 5 or so years have been fabulous because we've known about climate change, well, the last 30 years, but we haven't actually had to do anything about it. And as a country, we have chosen to do nothing in substance about it at all, though we do have a good framework that I'll talk about later. But there is a risk, and there is a growing risk now, that the government does actually start to bring in policies that actually shift climate change. And there is a risk that the same thing cascades down to local government. If so, then there will be consequences across the economy. And today I want to talk about that with a particular focus on transport. So I'm going to structure the conversation around 3 main elements. I'm going to very briefly revisit the science. Now, why we're bothering with all this stuff, because it's really not just about the paperwork. Then I'm going to talk about the words and the emergent paper-based, written down narrative, which is driving us towards change and action. And I'll argue that the science is really clear, that we shouldn't go above 1.5 degrees, top left. The words are increasingly 1.5 plus. There's enough wiggle room for politicians. But the action is well off the mark and is more like a 3-degree future. So I'll talk about what might happen if those things actually do line up. So firstly, the science. And the scientists are and have been screaming for a long time. The screaming has become louder in the last 5 or so years, that we really must do everything possible to not exceed 1.5 degrees of average surface temperature. So the reason for that is, there's lots of reasons for that, but there are a number of elements, what are called tipping elements or tipping points, that once reached represent a very rapid and in many cases irreversible, at least in human timescales, changes. Over the last 3 or 4 years, those tipping points, tipping elements have become better understood by science. And I want to share briefly with you with a few details around some of those and talk about the consequences of allowing our planet to warm up more than that. So these are the main tipping elements that are discussed. I'm not going to go through them in a lot of detail, but the ones I will highlight are the coral reefs. Now, even at 1.5, there's about a 67% chance of the coral reefs disappearing, and that's a global story of coral reefs, so it's normally illustrated on the right-hand side of Australia. There's 2 additional ones that matter quite some. So the West Antarctic ice shelf to the bottom, we may have already emitted too much carbon to stop that from melting. It represents 3 meters of sea level rise. If not, then we would most reasonably expect that to tip by the time we get to 1.5 degrees. So we have, if we haven't already gone too far, that will go in about a decade. The West Antarctic ice shelf has a big sister to the north called the Greenland ice shelf. That represents 7 meters of sea level rise. And same story, we may have already gone too far to stop that from melting, but if not, then our chance to stop it is the next decade. So collectively, those 2 things represent 10 meters of sea level rise. Now, that's not going to happen in decades. We're talking 100, 203 years, 300 years, but it is irreversible in thousands or tens of thousands of years. And 10 meters of sea level rise will be very awkward for society. The last one I'm going to highlight is the Amazon rainforest, which is often called the lungs of the planet. Depending on whose maths you believe, it represents 5 to 10% of the world's oxygen. And about now 18 months ago, a piece of work was published by some 200 scientists that had measured 120,000 trees in Africa and the Amazon with little tape measures, and over the course of a number of years assessed the extent to which that forest, particularly the Amazon, was absorbing carbon. And what they found is its ability to absorb carbon, not because we're cutting them down, but intact chunks of forest, was declining. And their best case guesstimate was that the Amazon rainforest would shift from being a carbon absorber, a sink, to being a release of carbon around 2034. So we have on that timeline circa, call it 10 to 20 years. There is wide range around that. It could be earlier, it could be decades later. But it's a sufficiently important risk that a precautionary approach would not be stupid. We have about a decade to do that, and to stop that from the Amazon to moving into really functional collapse in terms of its absorptive capacity. So when we hear this story about urgency in the science, 10 more years left, it is based in a really, really, really robust scientific base, which is about tipping points that we simply cannot undo. We have 10 years left to change this story. And in all of your thinking, and I'll argue later on, we need to be bringing urgency to bear on this. Sure, that urgency is uncomfortable, but wait till you see 10 metres of sea level rise. And we need to think about these two things in balance. It's a big thing to hold in head. So the words are also sort of moving towards, missing a page there. The words are also moving towards 1.5, but there's some wiggle room. So the Bank of England and the Financial Stability Board, which was set up by the G20 back in 2009 because they recognised that climate change was a massive risk to the economic system. Mark Carney, who was the governor of both for a while, said carbon emissions have to decline by 45% from 2010 levels over the next decade in order to reach net zero by 2050. This requires a massive reallocation of capital. If some companies and industries fail to adjust to this new world, they'll fail to exist. So the reason that's important is it was one of the financial grown-ups who made this claim. So this is a 50% less by 2030, but against a 2010 baseline. And also he brought to bear the concept that if you don't, you will die. So as an organisation, and particularly this is a private sector conversation, if you do not change, you will fail. And that is still the case in New Zealand, and I'll talk more about that later on. We also had down at government level, so the New Zealand government brought into place the Zero Carbon Act. We have the Climate Change Commission's work coming on now. And Auckland Council really led the charge of this with their embracing the C40 cities model back in 2018-ish, and agreeing to a 50% reduction versus a 2016 baseline by 2030. Now that only just snuck in as adequate in the eyes of the C40s. It should have been a 60% reduction by 2030, but in a sleight of hand of Phil Goff proportions, it somehow got through, and it is great. It's a great change, and I would argue it's actually the most politically leading move that anybody in New Zealand has made. What we're also seeing is a sentiment from the people, and here an example of a placard from the school strike protests of now 2019. But what we see, and we've run the research on this, is that there is a massive groundswell of support, particularly in the youth. And that's great. One of the issues is there are less of them as a cohort. There is a lot, not statistically, by numbers, there's a lot of boomers. And the older cohort votes a lot more. So we actually have a real structural issue. We have those who believe in the need for change and who bear the brunt of it are the younger generation. Those who are voting, and again, statistically, often voting against or not in support of the kind of action we need, are at the other end of the spectrum. Nonetheless, that is an unstoppable wave. It is just, the youth are just gonna grow up. So this is coming, and we need to think about the politics behind this. This is coming. The other words, and I could have put these in, probably should have put these in the science, is the health profession. Now, the World Health Organization has said that climate change is the single biggest health emergency and health crisis that we will see in the 21st century. It eats COVID for breakfast. It eats whatever pandemic you want to talk about for breakfast. And they have actually come out with a call, which has actually since been updated, a national emissions reduction target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. So that's their view, a health science view of what the scale of and rate of change that we need to pursue. And in terms of sort of other sort of more serious looking words, if we go back to 2018, we had the Productivity Commission work, which was an 18-month body of work. It was rendered out of date immediately 1 month later by the IPCC coming up. The Climate Change, the Zero Carbon Act came out, was signed unanimously by one person in 2019. Auckland Council formally signed off on their climate bill, their climate plan, a 50% reduction by 2030. The Climate Change Commission in 2021 has just come out with their draft reports. I'll comment on that in a moment, and will come out with their final one in about 3 months' time. Through the course of this year, we have 3 additional updates from the IPCC coming out. So that's an update of the stuff from way back in 2018, AR6. And the prevailing thinking is that science did not underestimate the badness of climate change, nor the need to move quickly. So whilst all of it hasn't been shown to light, there is emerging evidence that it's happening further and faster than what we thought. And therefore, there is a really compelling argument that whatever we think is acceptable science today probably won't be by Christmas time. And that should be kept in back of mind. These goalposts they're just gonna keep moving and moving and moving. And whatever we've done today is just not enough. So the government then has, depending on which line you put, we have the next COP in Scotland in October, December, where we have to talk to the UN. We have to put forward more aggressive versions of our promise to Paris. And the budgets come out from government, have to be agreed by government and legislation by the 31st of December. And then policies will trickle out. So that's the timeline, and that's the timeline for probably what will be the most transformational changes to society that we have seen since World War II, or maybe the 80s. But the action is really, really terrible, really terrible. This is a global level story. Pre-industrial average at the bottom of the curve, 0 degrees. We're currently globally about 1 degree above pre-industrial levels. Depends on where you are in the world. Australia is higher than that. The Arctic is higher again than that and is changing faster, but at a global average we're about 1. 1.5 you can see, which is the level that the IPCC says we should work really hard to not go beyond. And above that you have a bunch of things, but I'll draw your mind to the current policies in the middle, the blue bar. And that says that if you have a middling view of those policies, it's a 2.9 degrees increase above pre-industrial levels. Could be as bad as 3.9 and could be as low as 2.1 if you had a Pollyanna type view of the world. The other data point that I haven't included here but will speak to is the global insurance sector. They really, really understand risk. And they have a view that we are heading for a 3.8 to 3.9 degree world on current global promises, pledges, promises. So that's a global story. If you then look at the New Zealand story, we are holding great company with Scott Morrison, and that is a terrible audience to be holding good company with in the climate space. So this shows a body of work done by a group called the Climate Action Tracker, which is a NGO supported by a bunch of universities in Europe, and they assess the policies from nations that matter, which are the coloured ones up there. On the bottom you can see the scale. We have one country of all of them, which is Morocco from memory, that is doing okay. We have New Zealand and Australia in the orange category, which is insufficient. It's sort of somewhere between a 2 and 3 degree world. And then we have the highly insufficient. Of note, this was actually the December or November assessment from last year. Since then, China has moved the dial, and they've said that they are going to net zero 2060. So their colour will have changed. That chart is changing. But I guess the key punchline here is New Zealand is just woefully behind the 8 ball on all of this stuff, embarrassingly so. But there is a risk that changes, and that risk is growing by day. And if we see the response from the central government to the stuff that came out from the Climate Change Commission, it is generally, I would say, positive in that it is embracing it. Those changes, I would argue and will argue, are likely to be more than is currently proposed. But we should be thinking about a world where these kind of changes are a risk to everything we do. So I'll just pause there for a moment and see if there's any questions from the floor or any questions from our 30-second behind colleagues.
Here on the floor, it seems like we're good on the science. So if there's anything online.
Right.
There is one.
So 2 questions. I didn't quite understand your commentary on the Amazon. Did you say that for a given circumference, a tree in the Amazon now is less absorptive of CO2 than it was some time ago?
Correct. It's on a decline path on a per hectare basis. For intact trees, they're absorbing less and less carbon.
So you're suggesting that the photosynthetic process that's going on somehow doesn't work like it used to?
The process for absorbing carbon, of which photosynthesis will be part of it, is not working as it has in the past in its ability to absorb carbon. That's correct.
And that strike you as unusual?
Unusual in that it's different, yes.
Second question, Chair, through you. When you walk a mile in the shoes of most dairy farmers, beef farmers, sheep and beef and deer farmers in this country,
Yes.
Does that give you any sort of, well, what insights do you get from walking a mile in your shoes?
It looks incredibly hard. So I think the ag sector more broadly, those industries you talk about there, are really in an almost impossible position where the world is going to demand a transformation of what they are doing. Like, if we carry on the way we're doing, people are not going to buy our products. It's really simple. We're going to end up with either at a market level, people won't buy our products, or we're going to end up in a world of trade barrier apartheid where either regions or countries are deemed such high emitters that they're just not allowed to play with other players. So that's the global forces that are going against the continuation. Now, if we look at the other side of the coin, it's incredibly hard transforming those industries fast. These are industries that have been built and really in their current form supported by successive governments to build scale, rate, volume in a way that is, we look back now, incredibly irresponsible. But that has put farmers in a position where they now carry $65 billion of debt and they simply can't move on a dime. So as a nation, one of the questions I believe that our farmers are New Zealand's coal miners. We're either going to let our farmers die off or we're going to take a decision as a society, we're going to support them in a transition. Because that transition, it will happen. It will happen by markets, it'll happen by international trade laws, it's going to happen. Like, coal died and these industries will transform. Our question is not whether they'll transform, it's whether we support the human beings and the families behind that in making that transformation. Any other questions?
Yeah, a question.
Yeah.
I'm really pleased to see you. I saw your presentation at the EDS conference last year, and I was very keen to get you down here. I'm really pleased.
Thank you.
You mentioned tipping points and, for example, the ice sheets. I'm just wondering whether if we take the scale of change that the Climate Commission has suggested, which is like, you know, a 2% average till 2025, it's pretty small.
Yep.
Is there a danger if we just have that level of ambition, we could still have tipping points?
The short answer is absolutely yes. The proposed targets are laughably inadequate, and I'll talk more about that in a couple of slides. Okay, there's nothing from online? Or no? Okay, if there's nothing pressing, I'll move on. So the next question, next topic, it involves unicorns, and look, this is a little bit involved, but I just wanted to illustrate two things. One is the underlying assumptions behind the science that we're leaning on, and secondly, the inadequacy of the current, both the current government response, but I will also argue the inadequacy of what's proposed by the Climate Change Commission in the eyes of science. So up there you can see a multicoloured series of lines that are 47 scenarios aggregated by the IPCC in 2018, which represent global pathways in carbon dioxide to get us to either, at a global level, not exceeding 1.5 or exceeding it and then sort of falling back, so what they call low overshoot. Of those 47 odd pathways, only one of them does not have unicorns in it. And a unicorn in this story is a carbon capture and storage device, massive machines that suck carbon out of the air. So what is implicit in everything, including the work of the Climate Change Commission, is that we have these things at scale existing from kind of the mid-30s. You have to believe that to believe that scales of this change are adequate. So the only one, if we look at those different curves, the one within all of those that is kind of the closest to New Zealand, and it's hard because New Zealand has a weird emissions profile, is the green one. And this is in CO2 equivalent. But the only one that doesn't have unicorns is it's the blue one, I got them the wrong way around, is the blue one. And that requires globally, a much more rapid deceleration, reduction in our use of energy. It's called the low energy demand. It sort of not quite has everybody going back and living in a cave, but it definitely has a much lower consumption base than any of the other pathways. So, and down below here, I'll give an illustration of above the line is the gross emissions. It's actually net emissions, so after absorption by trees. Below the line, you can see a dark green line. So that's the line that is the closest to the New Zealand story, that assumes, and that gives a scale of the emissions we would have to be sucking out of the air over time. So what that means in practice is by about here, we would need to have enough machines sucking stuff out of the air equivalent to every car, truck and bus on the road today in order for us to be able to stick with only the green curve. Now, if you don't believe that we have 5 million machines to suck carbon out of the air by 2075, then the green line has to come down faster. And really, I guess my point here and my previous point is, it's all about this decade and it's all about fast. And up there, you've got the a couple of lines I've just run over the top of it. The two top lines are New Zealand's current policies, the two black lines, the black dotted line. So they're like way above even this line here, which is a joke because you have the equivalent of 2 billion motor cars sucking carbon by the, like that's a big build program. So we don't even get to that level on those black lines by 2030, which is that next decade. Our commitment, you will have heard the term NDC, Paris commitment, is the red line, and it still doesn't really get us anywhere close where we need to be. So the NDC is also grossly inadequate, and the Climate Change Commission have quite explicitly said that it's grossly inadequate. So in terms of levels of inadequacy of the Climate Change Commission's work, You can argue this a lot of ways. I think on balance, the Climate Change Commission is probably going to have to up their game quite some from where they are at the moment. They are, on most reasonable measures, a long way below the scale of change required by the science. They have to consider other things. They have to consider social, like so there's a mishmash of other stuff. Unfortunately, in their draft, they don't separate science and other stuff. They probably will in their next version. But if we just look at it through the basic lens, the lens through which the rest of the world will be looking at this, and that is CO2 equivalents. And across those 47 curves I showed you earlier on, all of those scenarios have a reduction versus 2010 levels by 2030. And I've lined them up. So this is 47 different scenarios across the year. This is that one where we go back and live in caves, but not quite. And over on the left-hand side, you see one lonely red bar. So that's the Climate Change Commission's recommended reduction by 2030. So we're off the scale low when looking at it through this. So the lowest of all of those scenarios run in 2018, which is below the science that's going to come out this year, is still 50% higher than what the Climate Change Commission said a week and a half ago. That's how the rest of the world's going to look at this. So to your question about aspiration, it is my opinion that if the PM goes to the COP later on this year, and or James Shaw, they will have to sneak in and sneak out the back doors, hoping that no one notices. Because the rest of the world's going to be looking at this and they're going to say, New Zealand, that's not enough. You've got to do more. So what might that look like? Again, a lot of ways to look at it, but the IPCC is very clear. That's a quote from their report. And model pathways of no limited overshoot of 1.5, global anthropogenic CO2 emissions decline by about 45 from 2010 levels by 2030. Even if you pretend methane doesn't exist, like it's just split gases, it's just methane and other long life gases, they've still all got to do that. Now, the New Zealand story for that is this thing on the right. It's roughly a 54% from 2017 levels, which in New Zealand means we had 81 million tonnes in 2017, 24 soaked up by trees, a lot of trees because we had a planting boom in the 90s, meaning 57 of net emissions. We will have to pull 31 million tonnes out of that, assuming we believe in unicorns and assuming we don't believe in global equity, doing more than our fair share as a country that's benefited, taking us back to 26-ish million tonnes by 2030. I've argued that this should be considered across all gases. And if we're not going to move much on methane, for the reasons we talked about before, methane is hard to move. It needs to move, but it's hard to move. Then other gases should bear the brunt of this. But really, to make the easiest of easy comparisons, I'll even take that off the table. I'll just say anything that's not methane has to reduce by 60% versus a 2010 baseline by 2030. And that's what everybody in this room should be thinking about is, do our plans support that? And if they don't, then fine, but either we or our successors are going to have to come back in a year or 2 or 3 and rewrite the plan. And in some cases, particularly where infrastructure is at play, we're going to have to undo that infrastructure. And a flavour of infrastructure I'm going to talk about a lot later on is roads. I'm going to comment briefly about Net Zero 2050. It has nothing to do with Net Zero 2050. So it is true that we need to get to Net Zero in 2050. And we could do that by wandering along until 2050 and then turning the lights off and going back to our cave. And that would blow through every limit that we have. So that was a narrative that was shared originally under the national government. Some scenarios were run by the Productivity Commission. These ones were introduced once James Shaw came in. They were more aggressive, heading towards 2050. But the IPCC came out in 1 month after the colourful curves came out and said you actually need to follow the dark black line at a national level if you believe in unicorns and if you don't believe in global equity. So I guess if I was to make one comment to you as leaders of your communities. Don't talk about 2050, net zero 2050. It's an abdication of responsibility. Tell me what you're doing in the next decade. And I think this is a pull from here from the RLTP, from your RLTP, I think. Got that right? And to illustrate this, it is awesome that there is a target, and that target is just nowhere near enough on transport. So I think great starting point, please triple it. And by 2030. And that is what the science demands. And sure, that's going to be hard, but so is 10 metres of sea level and trees that won't germinate. So we need to think about this in the context of what we will do if there is inaction globally. And it is true that the transformation that we need to make in the next decade or two is going to be really, really hard. And it's going to be a lot easier than the transformation we'll make if we don't act. And it's a lot cheaper than the transformation we'll make if we don't act. And it's a lot better for future generations if we act now. So urgency. So what you want to be doing for your RLTP is starting from a point which is, okay guys, we've got to pull 75% of our emissions out by 2030. I wonder how we might do that. And that's kind of, I guess, the conversation I'm going to start to wander us down over the next 40 odd minutes or so. I'll pause in just a moment, lest there be a question. Joe Biden said, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value. And so what we are seeing consistently across central government, we're seeing this in local government, we're seeing this at Waikato, we're seeing this in Auckland Transport, a narrative around a transformation, a narrative around climate change. But the substance of the budget is exactly the same as it was 5 years ago. What we're now seeing is a sprinkling of, in the transport space, a sprinkling of bike lanes and buses. Bike lanes and buses are not a condiment, they're the main event. And so if we do not see a turning on its head of our budgets, then we're absolutely being disingenuous about the scale and rate of change we're leading. And we're going to get rumbled. Like eventually we'll get rumbled. The politicians will get rumbled. Future generations are coming. And this change will happen. So let's make it now on our watch because the science is really, really clear. So I'll just pause there. Are there any questions or comments to that thus far? And I might grab a glass of water as well.
Before I open up to the others, I want to thank you for your clarity. And a thought that comes to mind is sometimes a big goal actually unlocks more creativity than incremental one.
Yes.
So, yeah, that's what I'm taking away from that.
And I think that's absolutely the case. What we see in most plans, and including the Climate Change Commission, is incrementalism. And it's just not going to get us there. In particular, it's not going to get us where the science demands society get to. And there are a lot of ways. Setting targets is always awkward. There's always a question of, is it possible? But at least one stream of thought should be a stretch. I wonder how we might do it. And then bring those together. We shouldn't be starting from a what's doable, or we'll just end up with kind of what we've done before. Great.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Yeah, just around buses and cycleways. I understand how that's possible in the urban environment. What do you see in the wider Waikato for our rural communities?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there's a couple of things. I think there's a really exciting opportunity in the rural space. So for quite a while, increasingly the last 2 or 3 or 4 years, the rural communities have kind of, in some quarters, been the villains of the story. And I think there's a real opportunity now to actually turn that around and have on the transport space, the rural communities lead. You know, they will need our support. They'll absolutely, that goes back to that earlier question of, are we really going to support our rural communities in transforming? Yeah. So what might that look like? There's probably a few e-bikes in there, but it's a very different story. And the real punchline there is electrify the farm. And we need to, and if we think about this on a 10-year timeline, what we're seeing globally, and focusing on the transport story, is every year there is an assessment of how rapidly electric vehicles of some flavour will roll out. The next year, the analyst comes out sheepishly and says, "I've got a bit wrong, I'm going to ramp it up again." And the leading player in that space is Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And every year for the last few years, they've done that. And they came out really sheepishly last year and just said, "We've got it wrong, we'll probably get it wrong again, but we think that we'll be at price parity, electric vehicles ICE, around 2023-ish, give or take a year or two." We're not talking about 2012 Leafs anymore. And I think that the imagination, we have a failure of imagination to think back to what happened when phones changed. Like, they changed fast. When you get to 2024, to buy an internal combustion engine car would mean to buy a car which is more expensive to buy, more expensive to run, less performant, smells funny, has a really terrible resale value. Like, why would anybody in their right mind do that unless they really, really like engines? I'm an engineer, I love beautiful cars, so I might buy one, but in general, it will make no sense. And therefore, I think we should be thinking about supporting the transformation of the way the rural sector moves around as a priority. And what does that mean? Like, there's lots of tools, accelerated depreciation or fringe benefit tax. There's a lot of tools that can be used at a central government level. It's less clear to me what is available at local government. So in short, they're different stories. There's an awesome opportunity to make the rural community the heroes and really lead that charge.
Cast your mind back to the young Paul as a 19-year-old going to engineering school, and think about what you contemplated you would see as an engineer in your professional lifetime. And I put it to you that there'll be a unicorn in there. And far be it from me, from my background, to say I believe in unicorns, but one thing I do believe in is there is no limit to the imagination of the human condition when it's really put to the test.
Yes.
So I think, with respect, the presentation around the unicorns is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, if I could probe you on that. And I do believe there will be technologies which will enable the capture of CO2. Not enough to get us to where we need to get to. I think what you're telling me is we need to consider the known unknowns, and we need to throw resource at the known unknowns. But I guess the question is, what in your mind, what are the possibilities that the unknown unknowns will get us out of jail?
They're absolutely possible. We can look back through history many, many times and see stuff turned up that was crazy earlier on. I don't know that I would bet the planet on them turning up, though. And I don't know that I would bet the planet on them turning up in 9 years. So I think that we shouldn't preclude those things turning up, but we shouldn't base a strategy on their arrival either. And if you believe the severity of some of the downside cases here, and they are, everybody has read the bad day scenario, really a precautionary approach would be, let's just assume maybe they don't turn up. And let's use the tools that we have in our tool chest, of which there are many. We know what to do. We absolutely know what to do. Let's do those, and let's let creativity roll. And so this, the one other comment I'd make about carbon capture and storage is there is a risk it is used by the carbon selling industry as a tool for the continuation of their business model. And if all we're doing is using carbon capture and storage to soak up old dead dinosaurs that have been burnt through machines, we're missing a trick. We should, if we are to use those things, we should be using them to pull out stuff we've already emitted.
I think I agree with your comments around that price parity. I think that's one of the flaws in the Climate Commission's analysis. They have that price parity for EVs and internal combustion engines much later than 2023, and I think that can have a profound impact on the modelling. But to go back to Angela's point about rural communities, you know, you could well be right about them being leaders because small towns are small to get across, so you can actually walk and cycle around them much more easily.
Yes.
And you can even have public transport. I come from Thames, population 7,000. We actually have a public transport bus operating, so you know it can be done. But I just my question is around the structure of transport planning. We've just seen in the news how like there's been cost overruns on motorways, and that means there's less to spend on cycling and walking and so on.
Yep.
And then at the regional level, you just showed that budget. We've got this scenario where local body politicians from all around the region have their pet projects. It's a bit like pork barrel sort of politics, and they all have their pet roading projects.
Yeah.
And they're the ones that dominate. And so, you know, cycling and walking gets a very tiny looking, but doesn't really feature. So I suppose my question is the answer to all this to have structural change the way we deal with these issues? Maybe more top down, you know, sort of from central government, so there's less.
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that. One is the funding structure we have in New Zealand for transport doesn't really support change at the rate we need to. And I think I would argue Waka Kotahi and Ministry of Transport, one, they haven't actually done the work. They're miles behind the thinking in all of this. And secondly, they're still really treating, Joe Biden would say they're really still treating these things as condiments. So whilst they will talk about a multimodal model, and they will say that they are ambivalent to how we get around, that's neither the structure nor the DNA of those organisations. To the pork barrel point, you have to, in your role, have to deal with the politics in this. And I think one of the things that we have done poorly as a nation is painted a story of the possible. One of the things I think is really exciting that's come out of this region, more than anywhere else, is the idea of the 20-minute city. Now, whether or not we roll with that, I think it illustrates the scale of thinking and illustrates an aspiration of what the world might look like. And it's that aspiration of that dream, which to some extent, we saw a little bit under COVID days. Like we had, at least in my part of the world, we had empty streets where I could actually put my kids on the street and they probably wouldn't die. And I could actually hear birds, and I really like those streets. So COVID exposed the streets that we want and the streets that we deserve in some corners. And I think we need to, it is incumbent on those of us in the leadership or those who have a platform to somehow articulate that vision. We haven't done a great job of that. We've been buried in a RLTP chapter 14.1, and people don't buy that. That's not how people work. People are busy. Like we know from our research that most people increasingly believe in this. We also know there's an incredibly vocal minority. There's the Gretas and there's the Donald Trumps, and unfortunately the good Donald Trumps are, you know, better resources. They vote more. They're better connected decision makers, so they're having outweight. And I think we're spending too long listening to a small but vocal minority, not listening to the remainder here, including those who are too busy to speak, and future generations. So if we were to include the voices of future generations, that vocal minority would just get laughed out of town. They wouldn't even get a stage. And so one of the challenges that you have is thinking about, you know, am I listening to that really loud woman or lady, or am I actually listening to my people?
Thank you. Anything online? No.
We have more questions.
Or we can have one quick more.
That tornado diagram you drew, and you made a comment about the forestry, and I think Rob Carr's group is saying we can't plant our way out of trouble. Is that, have I read that right?
So I didn't say that, but I absolutely agree with that. And a good example of a government narrative that carries no weight is, roughly speaking, in CO2 equivalent, we need to pull 35-ish million tonnes out. The Billion Trees program, on a really good day, as long as we deliver, might be 1. And we end up with a lot of pine at a lot of places that maybe we don't want them. So I think we can't plant our way out of this. Now, I also agree with the need to use native plantings in the longer term more cleverly. So we've got a big question about land use and migrating from a model we have at the moment, which is put a pine tree on anything that looks like grass, and the future model.
So the point of clarification will be, do you want to give us a comment then on your views around carbon pricing?
That's a big topic. Any particular element of that?
Well, you know,
Yep.
in country right now.
Yep.
And I needed huge chemworths to pull a unit load of lambs to slaughter.
Yep.
I'm thinking, you're asking me to sign up to the fact that I go and get rid of my chemworths and buy a truck that yet hasn't been invented to take ruminants against which something's going to happen to stop them magically producing methane and send them to the works, and it's going to be an electric truck, and I'm paying an extortionate power price because our government's decided it likes revenue streams from the dividends from the power companies. I'd be sitting there thinking, you know, this is all too hard. So the thing I'm really enjoying about your presentation is you're giving us the right questions to ask, and you're asking us to forget about, because as elected members, we get in our ear the commentary from the fringe, and you're saying to us, listen to my presentation and stop and block those emails from those people.
Consider blocking them. I mean, there's some valid comments, and we don't, you know, you never want to ignore a party, but you also want to ignore that there is, in New Zealand, 8% of the population does not believe climate change exists and or matters. You will never convert those people. They're incredibly vocal. They're writing letters, they're engaging. I mean, they're in my front door all the time. I've tried to convert them. I spent a year, 1 year going to university with 2 Christians. Every morning they were allowed to try to convert me. Every afternoon I was allowed to try and convert them. After a year, no one had converted anybody. And I feel like it's the same conversation with that cohort. It's just not worth the effort. So just, you know, where they do sit in that camp, ignore them. To your trucker, he or she today can only buy what's available. I would say, to the extent possible, stretch your assets. So don't buy a new thing, because the new thing you're going to buy is probably similar to the one you're going to buy a while ago. New things are coming. And to your comment on electricity, you know, the prevailing comment is that electricity is too expensive. It is still about 1/3 of the cost of liquid fuels as a means of locomotion, as a means of getting around. So once we do get electric underneath us, and electric is coming for all but maybe the largest of vehicles, then that will be a massive OPEX reduction for operators. And in fact, so much so, if you do not have those vessels, you'll go out of business. So in 2028, if you're a trucker and you're still running one of those things that's on diesel, assuming the stock turns up, your operating costs are going to be so high you're out of business in a couple of years. And that will self-regulate pretty quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
Oh, sorry.
There you go. And we can
Yeah. My uncle brought a recently a Porsche SUV, so it's petrol electric.
Yep.
His power bill went up $400 a month because he was charging every night at home. So now he just runs it on petrol because it's cheaper. And that's an electric. So that's what I said. Electricity is very expensive.
Yeah, I would. So he will have been paying more for electricity. He will still have been paying a lot more than he would have for lot less than liquid fuel. So what?
No, that's his reality. He's got it. So he runs it on petrol now. He doesn't use electric anymore because it's too expensive. It's $400 extra a month. And
yeah, so
it doesn't cost that much in petrol a month. So.
I would challenge his maths. So he must have only supply.
It was a business, you know. He sells businesses, and he actually won Business Seller of the Year. And he's not exactly a donkey. You know?
I mean, we've run the numbers on this a lot. And electricity for running a car in New Zealand is roughly 1/3 to 1/4 per kilometre of the cost of petrol. So I don't know why he had that experience, but I do know that, and I can give you paper. I can bury you in papers that support this. that electricity as a energy source for light vehicles in New Zealand varies petrol any day, even if you're not paying tax, even if you somehow got something that's diesel and you've somehow snuck around the tax bit. So I can't comment on that
Yeah, I know,
person's.
yeah. Maybe
Auckland
Power must be quite expensive.
Thank you.
If anyone else would like to ask a question, please just tap me on the shoulder. Oh, yeah.
Just to follow up on that question, so the diesel truck pays road use charges, and that's part of the cost.
Yep.
Currently, electric vehicles don't pay any road user charges.
Yep.
So once we reach a tipping point, there's going to be a significant increase in costs of those vehicles to maintain the infrastructure. So how will that affect the cost comparison?
Yeah, so it absolutely will require, at some stage, electric vehicles will need to pay their way for the infrastructure. Where that happens, probably a political question. There's still enough fat in that to cover the cost of that. It will still be cheaper, assuming we're still charging roughly the same per kilometre. It will still be cheaper to run electric. Economically, it makes, as stock becomes available this decade, it makes no economic sense to run petrol or diesel by the end of this decade. If you, in particular, the only reason you would do so is if you can't carry the capital cost up front of a new vehicle, which brings into play discussions of equity, which are very, very important issues. But the economics are pretty compelling.
Well, thank you. I suggest we follow on with the presentation, since I get the sense that there's always solutions towards the end, which is always my favourite. Yeah.
So I wanted to, and I'm really conscious of being an Aucklander coming to Hamilton, so I'm sorry, but I wanted to talk about the Auckland story. And this story is kind of a little bit more shambolic than the other stories because it involves politics. It involves multiple agencies. So I want to take you on a bit of a journey to show you what has happened to them. And in doing so, maybe inform what you might do here in order to raise your aspiration from 25 to 75% plus. So in the dying days of 2018, Auckland signed up to the C40 cities thing, and about the 13th of December, people had emotionally checked out, I suspect, which is how they got it away with it. A plan was put up to reduce emissions by 60% by 2030. The new year came around and people realised that what they'd been signed up to, so they, over the course of a number of months, backed that off to a 50% reduction. But that has prevailed, and in fact, Auckland signed up to this again with C40s at a higher burden of proof a couple of weeks ago. So what we've seen in Auckland is this aspiration being led by the council for the region, in spite of the council quite clearly not having all, or in fact many of the levers to do this. And what they did really, really well is they pulled together the aspiration. It was aligned with the science. Excuse me. It was aligned with the science, and they pulled together this horrifically big table that had all the things that they could do. And in there they had stuff we can do directly, stuff we can influence or lobby, and stuff that's completely out of our camp. And all of a sudden there you have the bones of a science-aligned plan. And clearly there's a lot of actors you've got to bring together. But for once we had everything in one place. And we knew, was this going to be solved by trees, by, culling cattle, by whatever. And in the Auckland story, we ended up with this. And that was there would be a 65% reduction in stationary energy by 2030. There would be a 64% reduction in transport. Zero in waste, and I haven't really got underneath the waste bit. And 23% in industrial process and product use, which is actually quite stretchy because in Auckland we have a steel mill, a glass industry, something else that pump out a lot of, these are not easy industries in a 10-year timeline to shift. Agriculture 15%, which was actually, and I thought a bit bold, stretchier than what was set up in the Zero Carbon Act of a 10% reduction by 2030. So that's the first thing. And from there, they jumped into a question of how to do that. So I take a step back now to middle of 2019. I'd undertaken this work, and I decided that it made sense to focus on Auckland and how would Auckland deliver on its aspirations, and do that because Auckland's a big part of the national economy. Transport was, I'd argue, the easiest of a bunch of hard things to move, and we had a very politically permissive environment in Phil Goff, who was carrying that can at the time. But it didn't seem that they had done the work on how they'd actually achieve that within transport, or achieve it within anything, in fact. So they had this 50% flag on a hill out at 2030, but no substance underneath it. And there was a lot of post-it notes flying around, but no numbers. So I ran some analysis on how Auckland might deliver that. And I presented it to a woman called Penny Holtz, who was then a councillor. And on a whiteboard, I sketched it out. This is how you do it in transport. And she went, oh, and she raced out of the room to try and get Phil Goff, and Phil Goff was funnily enough busy at the time. But we had an emergency meeting the next day, and with Phil Goff and his staff. And he scribbled down very tentatively, good eye for detail. And about a week, I thought that was the last I'd hear from him. But a week after that, he came out with his launch plan for his next election, and the scribblings from that were the basis of his transport plan. And what that did, that told me not so much that my plan was awesome, but that he had got nothing internally. So as a politician, he had simply not been given the options by his team on what he might do. He had not been told, hey Phil, you can do this and this, but it's going to be politically hard, or you can do this and this, but it's going to be really expensive. He'd just been given nothing. So if there's one thing I would really encourage is make sure that your teams are giving you options that are science aligned so that you can back them away if you want to. But make sure you're getting explicit quantified options. So I took this beyond the napkin stage, and I approached a leading consultancy firm about this, a crowd called MR Cagney at the top. And I said, I sent him an email to the CEO. I said, it looks to me like the Auckland plan, transport plan, is really terrible. Like, it looks like it will increase emissions. And he said, that's done. We're spending $30 billion. That's not the case. Everybody knows we've got a train set coming along. So I said, give me a chance. And I went in and talked to them. And at the end of the 1 hour presentation, they couldn't immediately fault it. They knew there was something suspicious about me, and they didn't really trust me at all. But they let me get out. And a week later, they said, do you think you could come back and talk to some other people? So I came back and talked to a slightly wider audience. And they still couldn't fault it. And then just before Christmas of 2019, they asked me back, and again, and God forbid there were actual clients in the room at that stage. And in that conversation, they said, look, this is quite striking, Paul. We're spending $28 billion over a decade. And according to your numbers, our emissions are going to grow by about 20%. And we cannot fault your thinking so far. We're sure there's a flaw somewhere. We can't fault it yet. So we're going to set up a team internally. And we're going to stress test what you've come up with. And we're going to prove you wrong. And we'll be back in February. So I came back in February and went in and met with the team, and they said, we'd hope you'd miss a zero, but you haven't. Like, we've done it independently, and you bang on, and nobody knows this. So there's this prevailing narrative about the 3 metres of cycle lane and the 2 extra buses that we're buying, and there's a tunnel going in for a rail, and everybody's using that as a proxy for the answer, whereas if you look at the numbers, it doesn't make sense. So they built a tool based on the analysis that is called Transport 2030. So this is a tool which is available. At the moment, it does Melbourne and Auckland. I would really encourage you guys to spend not very much. It'll be the highest value spend you have ever done to get this thing done so you can have informed discussions about outcomes and costs. So what I'm going to do now is walk you through the Auckland story. I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to show you the laughable inadequacy of the current Auckland plan, and then I'm going to talk to you about what an alternative plan that opens our streets and puts people at the front might look like. Okay, let's see if it will work. In a second, I'll set this up. So, can I fit more of that on a screen? Is there sort of a scaling thing on there. It's going down.
Just hit control.
So I'll explain what these things are for those like me that are visually impaired. So on the right-hand side, you can see emissions from moving people around in Auckland. In 2018, the left of those three bars, it was 2.8 million tonnes. To the right of that is a 2030 baseline that assumes that the population growth that we're anticipating happens, and it assumes we travel around roughly as we do today. To the right of that is a scenario builder, and that will get turned on, that will grow or decline as I turn policies on or off. Each of those policies have political and economic costs associated with them. Below that, we have two lines. You see the yellow line across the middle. The yellow line is a 50% reduction. That assumes everybody in Auckland drops equally. That means that half of the steel mill closes. That means half of the cows disappear. That means, you know, it's probably not going to work like that. So if you assume the steel mill stays open, if you assume that ag does roughly what's in the zero carbon bill, you get to the green line for transport, a 70% reduction by 2030. If you believe my national story, we need to make that more or less completely go away. But let's just stick with a softer target of 70% reduction. So first I want to talk about the current plan. So the current plan. So when I talked to a minister associated with transport the other day, and I said, I don't think it's enough. And he said, earnest politician voice, we have quadrupled the number of trips on public transport in the last decade. We can do that again. And I said, yes, that's true. And it will cost you $5 billion and it will reduce emissions by that much. But wait, as one reporter said, I think your website's broken, Paul. No, what you will see at the top is the baseline was 3580. The right-hand bar at the top has gone down to 3552. So we've blown through, excluding the money for the CRL already, which is probably 4 or 5 billion. We've got to spend another 4.5, subject to it being on budget, and that will reduce our emissions by about 1%. So it's not that it's a great, bad project. It is the sort of project that leading cities will have. It is the sort of project that we might have, that we might want our city to be based on. But let's not kid ourselves that it does anything other than reduce 4 months of population growth in Auckland. You might have also heard of the light rail in Auckland. So we don't know exactly what flavour that will take. There are two of those, the Northwestern and the City Rail. Depending on whose numbers you believe, they will cost between $10 and $15 billion. They will probably cost more than that. And again, like the CRL, they may be great projects. I'm not arguing whether or not they're great projects, but having spent $10 to $15 billion, we've now removed another 2% emissions by 2030. Remembering we need to get to the green line. So like at this rate, it's going to take a lot of money, like in a lot of tonnes. I'll then turn on all of the other big sort of capex heavy and climate positive projects. So the airport to Botany, bus route, Isthmus connection, these are all bus route projects. So we've spent now somewhere between $20 and $25 billion. And we can't even see the 2018 emissions. The scary thing about this is none of the grown-ups knew this. So I presented this to the board of Waka Kotahi. Maybe we should put this in our decision making. Similarly, no one has done this analysis. It's not actually that hard. You've got to do it. This would be really easy to do for your region, like really easy to do. Like it took me a weekend to do this. Well, that's awkward. But we've got some other things in our back pocket in Auckland. We've got a cycling project. Cycling investment plan, which we're behind on. But it's worth noting that that delivers almost the same benefits as everything else in emissions. And has roughly a 10 times payback on climate versus those infrastructure, other things. And again, I'm not saying those other things are not great projects. If we're awash in cash, do them all. But it's worth thinking about. We've also talked about bus electrification. It's been a real political hot potato. Everybody hates diesel buses. So if we bring in the diesel bus electrification plan, it'll cost somebody billions of dollars. Doesn't move the dial a lot. To put numbers to that, bus emissions in Auckland, total transport emissions in Auckland are around 4.5 million tonnes. Bus emissions are about 80,000 tonnes. So, look, I'd rather not have diesel buses, but let's think about it in the context and also the spend of those as well. But we're also going to electrify the cars a little bit. So if we just allow for kind of current rebate kind of market level forces, you get to there. That's the Auckland plan. So that was the Auckland plan last year. Auckland Transport, sort of that weird structure that it exists in Auckland, signed off a similar plan last year. In their plan, they didn't measure carbon. There's no measure of carbon in their plan. They didn't measure vehicle kilometre travel, almost like they didn't know about climate change. And they have released a draft RLCP which allows for a 6% increase in emissions by 2030. So I talked about a shambolic story. We have a council which is advocating a 64% reduction in transport, and Auckland Transport, which is conveniently didn't hear that story, 6% increase, while spending $25 to $30 billion. So that's where they're at today, but there's another way we can do it. And I wanted to quickly show what another way might look like. And then I'll pause for discussion. And the other way has us rethinking, and this is mainly an urban story, though I think it can to some extent, you know, in those sort of peri-urban places, the small towns that are surrounded by urban, I think the same story prevails for a lot of our travel. Now, a lot of trips are actually short trips. So, an alternative plan. So, we could do those projects that I turned on before or not, but in the interests of, to illustrate the point, I'm not going to put them on, and in doing so, I'm going to save or defer $20 to $25 billion worth of spend in Auckland. It does leave us with half a tunnel, which is politically awkward, I know. But. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get really serious about cycling. I'm going to open our streets to our people and provide them with a safe, healthy and equitable way, an equitable option. They don't have to take a bike, but an option that they can get around if they want to. And we know that in Auckland, more than half of our trips happen are a few, 2 or 3 kilometres. 2 weeks ago, the UK Transport Secretary said all cities and towns will, in 2030, will have half of all trips taken by bike or on foot. They're the cities in the world we're competing with. If you want to bring talent here, don't look like a car-centric city. You look like a car-centric town. You look like Rome in 1960. So we need to recognise if we want to be a place where talent lives, we want to bring families and businesses to these places, they've got to shift away from autocentricity. So with that punchline and spending a lot less, I'll turn on, where are we? That. So just doing cycling at scale, and that is using existing, for the most part, existing roadways, existing public space. It's not cash expensive. It is politically a little bit challenging, though there are ways around it. We've got 400,000 tonnes out. The second thing we do is we get really serious about buses. And we do that by opening our streets to buses. And in the Auckland example, in peak traffic, 40% of commuters come across the Harbour Bridge on a bus now, with a combination of the bus lane to the north that feeds it. If they were to come as they did a decade ago because of population growth in Auckland, we would need 3 additional lanes on the bridge. So either yet another massive infrastructure project or a really, really awkward narrowing as you head to the city. So in addition to other levers that we're not pulling hard enough, reduce the number of trips taken, work from home, study from home, think better about the way we deliver things, and also reducing the average trip length. We have built cities around a car-centric model of a mall. Drive to Bunnings. Bunnings has always got loads and loads of car parks. What we need to do is support our local communities, support our local businesses. And all I'm arguing here is that we travel, on average, 10% less per year. So those two levers alone have got us back to below 2018 levels. And those two levers are well and truly within the influence of this group. We'll then carry on. I won't bother electrifying buses. We should, but I won't. We'll get serious about emission standards. There are things that we can do for that. No one should ever bring a new Ranger or Hilux into the country. If you do, you have to have a sticker on your forehead. So each one of those that comes in is the equivalent to cutting down 50 mature kauri trees. We need to stop bringing those carbon bombs into the country. And you guys can do that today by putting out a rule tomorrow that says, if you've got a high emissions vehicle, keep it for another 2 years until a more compelling alternative comes, because they are coming. And I'll tell you what, there is no difference between a 2018 and a 2017 Hilux. So there are things that we can do today that will change that model. So if I reduce the emissions across our fleet, the average car with an engine in the fleet in 2030 has emissions the same as the average new car in Japan in 2014, then it does that to our emissions profile. So if you want to do one thing, do that. And why is that the case? New Zealand's one of the only countries in the OECD that has no emissions standards. That is changing, but the newest standards that are coming in are weak. So we need to strengthen those. And roughly speaking, if it's got an engine, it shouldn't look like more than a Prius by about 2025, 26. And we need to stop today, and you and your leadership stop today buying new petrol and diesel cars. Drag them out, just use them for longer. It creates jobs. It actually creates maintenance jobs. And there's not a safety issue. A car from that period 2 or 3 years ago is the same as a car from a year ago. We follow in Norway's footsteps and we electrify the fleet. And the emergence of OEM vehicles looks like it'll support that. There is a very real second-hand car issue coming up because Japan doesn't have many second-hand electric cars. And the other thing we do is we make sure that when cars are used, and cars are awesome and will still be part of the mix, in particular in a region like this, where sometimes you're travelling locally, but sometimes you've got to go further. Cars are still part of the mix. But let's discourage cars that have 1.1 people in them. In Auckland, the average is 1.58. It's 1.1 during the day. That's crazy. That's a lot of steel. That's 2 tons of steel to move 80 kg of meat. It's really inefficient. So if we just take that 1.58 up, and you are bringing in things like congestion charging, you're making parking harder, you're not providing free parking to your staff, God forbid, then we've got to a 70% reduction in our emissions. So we have spent in Auckland, call it $15 billion less than we were otherwise spending. We have opened our streets to cycling and buses. We have reduced the number of effective cars on the road. I haven't been talking about this chart down the bottom right. That's cars on the road. The previous scenario had more cars on the road. It's more congested. This one is actually, if you do need to drive, it's a better driving experience. Now, we want other options for you, but it's better. So this is better for everybody. And to do that, we need to turn the triangle on its head. We need to be able to really honestly say, we value opening our streets to our people because this is our budget. And I guess that, I'll close now, lest there be any questions, with that comment.
Thank you very much, Paul. Do we have any questions from the committee members? Dennis?
We need this model for the Waikato.
Yeah, absolutely. I think absolutely. I mean, the ministry, all of them have said, "God, this is amazing. This would be so helpful to talk to the minister." Can you afford the amount? Happy to spend $10 billion on stuff, but not tens of thousands to do this thing. It's crazy.
So you said it was easy to do, and how expensive would it be?
Oh, I'd get you to talk to the good people at MR Cagney, but less expensive than the mistake of not using it.
Sure.
You know, they've done a fabulous job of supporting this for nothing because they believe deeply that this is the right. They also believe about a transformation in transport. So there's a lot of people behind the scenes doing a lot for love at the moment.
And are other regions taking it up?
Other regions have talked about it. It's quite hard. You know, everybody says, "Oh, that's amazing," but I can't. You know, I haven't got budget for it. So if I was to encourage one thing, get that and have a conversation with that in a month. It would be my suggestion. It would be the best money you've ever spent.
Councillor McPherson.
Thank you very much for that. That's outstanding. I really enjoyed that. I mean, what that allows us to do is to have some cerebral gymnastics, and that'll be really helpful for us as a council. And you know, the answer seems obvious, but immediately I get in my mind, but what about all the stranded capital? You mentioned the billions of dollars that are tied up in farm debt. You talked about half a rail tunnel might be a problem. I think that'll pale into insignificance compared to what's going to happen in our rural communities, because it sort of strikes at the very heart of where New Zealanders have grown this country and deployed their capital. Have you got any sort of commentary about, so how do we translate that narrative to one that is going to be compelling economic sense? Because what I'm seeing up there for rural communities, with the amount of money they've got tied up in their farming businesses, etc., will be actually quite a hard sell and difficult politically to sell too. So have you got any guidance for us or insights?
Yeah, this does come back to the question of whether and how as a society, and that comes to central government, we're going to support the transformation that the rural sector does need to make. Like, the rural sector cannot carry on doing what it's doing, and it is debt, for the most part, heavy debt, and a lot of people under just massive amount, like humans under a lot of pressure. So I would argue the central government needs to come to the party to support the transformation to a lower OPEX model. So bar the man with that car over there, for most vehicles it will be a much lower operating cost running these vehicles. There's a finance question, and we know that the banks have started to walk back from the rural communities already. So I think there's a really important question about how we finance those rural communities into these alternative ways of getting around. That's the heavy vehicle side, but there's also a opening our streets story that is just as prevalent in the back blocks of central Gisborne as it is in central Auckland, and that is we need to deprioritise the primacy of the private motor vehicle, and we need to create options for other people to get around. So one thing that we might think about is schemes to get people on e-bikes. Now, it's not for everybody, but how can we encourage the use of e-bikes? Make parking available only if you've got an e-bike. There's 1,000 ways that we could do this. You also mentioned the term narrative, and I think where this region has led in a way is this idea of the 20-minute city as a concept. What we're missing is a vision and something that can get people in heart. There are solutions to this, but it's a story around making our streets, opening our streets to our people, making them safer, making them healthier, making them more equitable. We know driving's not great for us. We know that we shouldn't be driving 2 kilometres. That's a cracking walk that will make everybody healthier. And we're missing that story at the moment.
Paul, please, interesting answer. But when it comes to farmers, and you said that the banks are walking away, my plea for you is when you go home, trust me, banks walking away from farmers is seriously painful.
Absolutely, yes.
And it causes so much distress in rural communities, and it is getting worse.
Exactly.
So my only plea, I really like your presentation, is when you're advising government, and if you've got the ear of government, that's the one thing they could do to help. get this over the line is because farm ownership's a low yielding asset class, and if there's high debt, that's a toxic mix at the best of times. So this is the one area where you could help us as a region.
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that, and the vehicle I would use for that is actually a human conversation, is that there are farmers who are in a lot of pain at the moment. We need to decide whether as a society we're going to help those people or not. And then one of the ways that we might do that is through banking. We haven't had that first conversation yet. I think we're still largely ignoring that at a country level. And it's, I mean, farming clearly in the ag sector has been a wonderful villain in the story, and I think we need to change that narrative as well. It's not helpful. I think there is an. So I have not done and would not claim to be a deep expert in, the evolving ag models. What I would comment on with high confidence is that the status quo cannot carry on. And I see two pathways. One is that sectors or the sector fails completely and simply doesn't exist in a decade or two. So that land goes to something else. Now, I think that is an absolutely credible pathway that the country could take. The other one is that we support and/or those farmers transform themselves away from the current model, including transport as part of that, and that will require support. But the status quo, this is not going to happen. Like, and I can say that with my day job view of looking at market structures and economics, and looking at where things are going internationally. There's a story about us having the lowest emissions cat milk in the world. It's like a menthol cigarette. Like, it's still a cigarette. It's, the rest of the world is looking at this, and to them it looks high emissions, and that's going to cause a massive amount of pain to our communities. So I'd come back to the central question. We've got to make a decision as a country how we're going to support that transformation. I don't know that I can tell you a few ways it might go.
Yeah. It sounds like we've got one more question, and then we'll wrap it up so that you can.
Paul, very interesting presentation, and thank you. We have to be careful we don't kill a golden goose, which is primary production, where Councillor McPherson's coming from, because we need that to keep our economy fueled, and we all know that. This is a political question a little bit. You've touched a lot on EV, and I drive an EV car. They're 8 cents a k actually to run, but smaller car. But I think our politicians in our country also have to get our head around, do we not, of being able to build more hydro stations and be more open to build more wind farms, because there's a varying degree of acceptance across New Zealand whether we should be building more hydro dams, whether we should be polluting our landscape with wind farms. And then you've talked a bit about EV today, but you haven't talked about hydrogen. And the hydrogen projects are here and now. There's 20 new trucks, I believe, coming to the economy in June of this year. And you've stressed the importance of doing this really quickly. I'm not sure we can, from my point of view, I'm not sure we can accelerate that change fast enough. You're warning us that we should, but as a country, and you talk about being mature and putting our big boys pants on, we're going to have to accelerate a whole lot of thinking, are we not, around accepting change, both where population's based, but also energy change, and quickly.
Yes, there's a lot underneath that. I'll make a comment to a couple of it. One is, don't worry about the electricity. It's there. So if we electrified every single vehicle in the country, including trucks today, it would require a 14% increase in the amount of generation.
Well, there's a big debate. There's recent reports only of 2 weeks ago that we haven't got enough power. So
we haven't got enough today, and it would require 14%. We have built that in a decade before. We can build. Don't worry about the electricity. The electricity, what you do want to worry about is the transmission capacity.
But for instance, one party called the Greens do not want hydropower in New Zealand. I'm saying we've got to get this as a country clear in our heads.
Yep, we don't need it. We simply don't need it. So that is I think that is I'm rushing a little bit, but we have ample. I spoke to the CEO of one of the gentailers the other day. They've got enough projects lined up that are nowhere near hydro to power every single car and truck already consented today. Their concern is, can I get the power where I need it? And that's a transmission question. But that's hundreds of millions of dollars. That's chump change in the scheme of things. I'm mindful of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the level of engagement. Actually, I can sense a lot of some stunned faces in the room, some really enjoying this. And you've given us a lot to think about. The challenge is obviously to do something and do it fast. But thank you for the great quality of the questions as well.
Thank you.
I'll hand over to Councillor Angela Strange to close. Thank you again. But yeah, really appreciate you coming here today.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. Yeah, Dr. Paul, thank you for coming. As chair of our Public Transport Regional Connections Committee, you've given us a lot to think about. And also, yeah, I love the solutions you provided for the urban areas. Yeah, so keen just to maybe explore how we can support the rural communities better. But yeah, no, thank you for all that you've given us today, and look forward to engaging with you further. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for having me, and thanks for this conversation.
Right, so we just stretch our legs for a couple of minutes and then we can get into the Climate Action Committee.